TRADCAST Express. TRADCAST Express, it's Saturday, October 5th, 2024. Eric Sammons is the editor-in-chief of Crisis magazine, and this past Tuesday, October 1st, he published a 4-minute video clip on his Twitter account, which begins thus.
I've decided that I will no longer criticize Pope Francis for the remainder of his pontificate.
Well, Sammon then goes on to explain that his decision is the result of prayer and yada yada yada, and that this does not mean that he suddenly agrees with Francis or anything, only that he will no longer criticize him. Now, isn't that interesting? Just as Francis has openly flaunted his apostasy more than ever before, in Singapore and in his video message of September 18th, in which he said that religious diversity is a gift from God, just as Francis has never been more obviously apostate, Sammons decides not to talk about him anymore, at least not in a negative way. Perhaps it's just a coincidence, but I find it odd. Perhaps he's simply realized that the contradiction is too obvious, that it's too difficult to keep showing how much of a modernist Francis is, while at the same time insisting he's the Pope. I don't know. What I do know, however, is what Crisis magazine published 2 days after Sammons' announcement, namely an article written by Derek Taylor entitled Love for St. Peter and His Successor. In that essay, no matter how well-intentioned the writer might be, that essay is clearly not informed by Catholic doctrine, but simply puts forward the inchoate musings and half-baked personal ideas of the author. And while that may be excusable on a personal level, because, we're all trying to figure this out and not everyone understands everything clearly right away, it becomes problematic when it's published on a website meant to instruct Catholics about these issues. I mean, for heaven's sake, Taylor calls the Pope the Vicar of Peter. Why does an article like that get broadcast to the whole world? We've got it linked in the show notes, by the way, so you can verify this for yourself. The author begins the article with the confession of Simon Peter that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, in St. Matthew's Gospel, chapter 16. And toward the beginning of the article, he writes, quote, "With his confession and Christ's bestowal of the keys upon Simon Bar-Jonah, he became Peter, the living, visible mark of Christ's authority on earth." Unquote. Even that is wrong. When Simon made his confession, yes, he became Peter, as Christ declared. But our Lord added, "And upon this rock I will build my church, and I will give to thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven." That's in verses 18 and 19. And that shows that although Peter had already been designated Pope, he did not become Pope until after the resurrection, when Christ said to him, "Feed my lambs, feed my sheep," in St. John's Gospel, chapter 21. The First Vatican Council confirmed that when it taught, quote, "And upon Simon Peter alone, Jesus, after his resurrection, conferred the jurisdiction of the highest pastor and rector over his entire fold, saying, 'Feed my lambs, feed my sheep,'" unquote. And you can find that in Denzinger, number 1822. All of that is significant because it shows that when Peter denied Christ during his passion, he was not Pope yet. So all those semi-traditionalists who love to argue that Peter denied Christ as a sort of historical precedent for Francis teaching apostasy couldn't be more wrong. Besides, Pope Leo XIII made clear in an allocution to cardinals on March 20th, 1900, quote, "The Church has received from on high a promise which guarantees her against every human weakness. What does it matter that the helm of the symbolic bark has been entrusted to feeble hands when the divine pilot stands on the bridge where, though invisible, he is watching and ruling?" Unquote. And Pope Pius XII taught in his address Ancora una volta of February 20th, 1949, quote, "The Pope has the divine promises. Even in his human weaknesses, he is invincible and unshakable. He is the messenger of truth and justice, the principle of the unity of the Church. His voice denounces errors, idolatries, superstitions. He condemns iniquities. He makes charity and virtue loved," unquote. The links to that in the show notes. Now, speaking of semi-trads, the so-called Catholic Identity Conference just took place this past weekend, and as always, it was emceed by Michael Matt of The Remnant, who just released a video with a brief talk from the conference entitled "Michael Matt Leads 800 in Declaring Holy War." I'd like to play just a few clips from that.
It has become abundantly obvious that the world is languishing under what Pope John Paul II called the Great Apostasy.
Okay, so my unsolicited advice would be, if you're going to make the case that we're in the Great Apostasy, and no doubt we are, you may not want to quote as an authority warning against it a man who was chiefly responsible for helping to bring it about. At least that's the impression one gets from reading The Remnant, right? In any case, just for the record, John Paul II did not refer to the Great Apostasy. He spoke of a silent apostasy. And that was in his apostolic exhortation Ecclesia in Europa of June 28th, 2003, paragraph 9. But there's more from Mr. Matt and his Identity Crisis Conference. Please listen closely.
On September 13, 2024, Pope Francis concluded his visit to Singapore with the startling assertion that all religions are paths to God. There is only one God, Francis said, and each of us has a language to arrive at God. Some are Sikh, Muslim, Hindu, Christian. They are different paths to God. When confronted with this unbelievable papal novelty, which I stress is what it is, a novelty. This is not the teaching of the Church, this is a novelty. It's not infallible. When confronted with such papal novelty, faithful Catholics find themselves in the unenviable position of having to resist.
Did you notice it? Matt did not call what Francis said heresy or even error. Perhaps on the advice of his lawyerly friend Christopher Ferrara, he simply called it startling and novelty. I find that striking. Not that Matt doesn't believe it's heresy, of course he does, and his own paper says so in its latest edition, but just at that pivotal moment, when he's supposedly leading 800 in a holy war, proclaiming the social kingship of Christ, by the way, that's what's meant by that, he stays uncommitted and just denounces a startling novelty. But you know what? The problem with what Francis said in Singapore is not that it was startling, nor even that it was a novelty. The essential problem is that it was heresy. Heresy that denied and undermined all of Catholicism, and even the very concept of divinely revealed religion. We talked about that in the last TRADCAST Express number 197. And yet, all Michael Matt could say in that talk is startling novelty. Now, to be fair, I don't know if he denounced it as heresy at some other point in the conference, but at least in that particular talk, he didn't. And I find that bizarre. Just when people should be screaming the loudest, heresy, apostasy, the great leader of 800 says startling novelty. Although he did, of course, use his signature yell.
Whatever happened to that?
Yeah, okay, well, let's move on here.
TRADCAST.
We're from the Vatican, and we're here to help. These menacing words will soon be heard in the halls of the Fraternity of St. Peter, because Pope Francis, well, technically the Vatican Dicastery for Institutes of Consecrated Life and Societies of Apostolic Life, has announced that they will conduct an apostolic visitation of the fraternity. In a communique dated September 26, 2024, the FSSP, not to be confused with the Lefebvrist SSPX, announced, quote, "The priestly Fraternity of St. Peter, FSSP, has recently been informed by the Dicastery for Institutes of Consecrated Life and Societies of Apostolic Life of the opening of an apostolic visitation of the fraternity. As the prefect of this dicastery himself made clear to the Superior General and his assistants during a meeting in Rome, this visit does not originate in any problems of the fraternity, but is intended to enable the dicastery to know who we are, how we are doing, and how we live, so as to provide us with any help we may need," unquote. Now, there's really no predicting the outcome of this at all. Francis loves to defy expectations. He's shown that time and again in the last 11 years. Let's just recall that on February 29th of this year, the FSSP leadership had an audience with Bergoglio in the Vatican, and during it, the false pope told them it is his wish, not his command, but his wish, wink wink, that FSSP priests can celebrate or at least attend the annual Novus Ordo Chrism Mass with the local bishop. So let's just leave it at that for now. In other news, on October 2nd, Francis received an ecumenical delegation from Germany made up of both Novus Ordos and Lutherans. In his address, he told them, quote, "All the richness of our faith is a gift from God that we receive not only for ourselves, but always for others too, for the people around us, including those who seem to be far from faith, who have not yet heard talk of Christ, or who think he has nothing important to say to us. It seems to me that the life of many people today is lacking in the meaning, hope, and joy that the world cannot give. Therefore, I urge you to share the meaning, hope, and joy of faith with everyone with confidence and humility," unquote. That is insane. Look closely at what he's doing here. He's telling a group of people consisting of Catholics and heretics, well, Novus Ordos, but, Catholics and heretics, that they both share the same faith. He talks about our faith, and he's telling them to share it with others, with non-Christians. Now, of course, that may very well be standard Novus Ordo Vatican II theology, the gift that keeps on giving. But look at how insane that is in light of the true Catholic faith as practiced, believed, and taught before Vatican II. Lutherans and Catholics do not share the same faith. There is no our faith. So keep that in mind when some Novus Ordo apologists like Michael Lofton or Jimmy Akin points out that Francis frequently tells people to share their faith, to proclaim the gospel. Well, this is what we're talking about. The false gospel of ecumenism. A doctrine according to which both the Catholic and the heretic share the same faith. Where Lutheranism and Catholicism are basically the same thing. Where it doesn't matter if you're a Catholic or a Lutheran. So if Francis tells Catholics to evangelize, well, he also tells Lutherans to evangelize. And it's actually a very similar thing with regard to life issues. Sure, Francis will condemn abortion in the strongest terms, but by the same token, he will condemn capital punishment, which is not only not the same as abortion or even similar, it is not wrong at all in principle, capital punishment, that is, and it was in fact explicitly commanded by God in the Old Testament and approved by God in the New Testament, and it was continually taught as morally licit by the Church, and it was taught that way until the death of the last true Pope, Pius XII, in 1958. Now, the Novus Ordo apologists will say, well, Catholics and Lutherans do have the same faith when it comes to Jesus Christ. They both believe he's the Son of God, the second person of the Blessed Trinity, and Redeemer of the world. And while at least on the surface, both Catholics and Lutherans may share certain same beliefs, it is nevertheless not the same faith. Chances are you've heard me quote this many, many times before, but I'll do it again for all those who haven't heard it yet or who may have forgotten. In 1914, Pope Benedict XV wrote in his first encyclical letter, Ad Beatissimi, paragraph 24, quote, "Such is the nature of Catholicism that it does not admit of more or less, but must be held as a whole or as a whole rejected." Unquote. The faith cannot be had in elements. And the reason is that faith is assent to God's revelation. And since the same God has revealed all dogmas, you cannot withhold that assent on some of them, or even just one of them, without destroying the basis for believing the other dogmas. In other words, if you deny one, you deny them all, because then the motive for believing, which is essential to faith, no longer holds, namely, that the God who cannot lie and cannot be mistaken has revealed them. You know, at the end of the day, you can only take Pope Francis as a whole, like the whole package. You cannot cherry pick individual statements of his and say, hey, look, these are orthodox, so therefore all the heresy and blasphemy and other garbage he spews must somehow be twisted into orthodoxy. No, that's not how it works. A man who habitually denies the faith and teaches heresy and other grave errors, even if at other times he sounds orthodox, is not a Catholic, but an enemy of the faith and of the author of that faith, Jesus Christ. By constantly excusing his errors and twisting his heresies into something that can barely be considered orthodox, all the Francis apologists are doing is they're keeping the charade alive, thereby perpetuating the problem. Clearly, Bergoglio is not Orthodox, is not Catholic, and does not teach Catholicism. The fact that he sometimes says things that are good and teaches what is true does not change that fact. Name one individual on this planet who doesn't sometimes say something that is true or do something that is good. Look, I can affirm that 2 + 2 = 4, and everyone can praise me as a man of mathematical purity. But if at another time I make clear that I only said that 2 + 2 = 4 because it felt right, and that I believe 2 + 2 = whatever feels right to you, then I've just proven that I totally reject the laws of mathematics. And even when I affirm that 2 + 2 = 4, even then it means nothing. Because the basis for my belief that 2 + 2 = 4 has nothing to do with arithmetic at all. And therefore I can affirm all day long that 2 + 2 = 4, it doesn't mean squat. And similarly, when Francis talks about proclaiming the gospel, it means nothing. He makes clear time and again that he doesn't mean the true gospel, for one thing, right? I mean, look, the man believes there's no essential difference between Lutheranism and Catholicism. You can add that to your Sedevacantists are just a bunch of Protestants stack of files. And you know, that belief of his, that there's no essential difference between Lutheranism and Catholicism, that belief of his is actually quite compatible with his view that religious diversity is a gift from God. All right, one last quick news story from OSV News, October 4th. Quote, following the death of an American woman in a so-called suicide capsule in Switzerland and the arrest of several people involved in her death, a Swiss bishop said the device is dangerous and that people willing to use the capsule should be deferred to palliative care instead. Unquote. The Novus Ordo bishop in question is Felix Gmür, though we may just want to call him Captain Obvious. He is the false shepherd of the diocese in which this killing took place. Yeah, I mean, who would have ever guessed that a suicide capsule could be dangerous, right? I would add that it's life-threatening, even. But apparently, Gmur isn't even saying it's dangerous because it's meant to kill the one who uses it. Rather, and this is a quote from the fake bishop, the suicide capsule is dangerous because, unlike other assisted suicide organizations, a medical assessment is not required. Unquote. Yes, these are the words of a supposed Roman Catholic bishop in the year of our Lord 2024. You can't make this stuff up. This is not a silent apostasy, folks. It's an apostasy that's being shouted from the rooftops. TRADCAST Express is a production of Novus Ordo Watch. Check us out at tradcast.org, and if you like what we're doing, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution at novusordowatch.org/donate.